Welcome to Birdsong. I'm your host, Kayuta Kiora, and in this episode we have Dean Pinonsui joining us. Dean has been living in Peru studying traditional Amazonian plant medicine for the past 8 years in the Shipibo tradition over at the Ayahuasca Foundation. And when a couple of our previous guests suggested to have him on the show, I thought it would be a great idea to listen to, receive, hear his insights, his perspectives, his knowledge, and his wisdom gained from the plants in such a deep immersion living over there in the jungle. Before our conversation, Dean shared with me that pinonsui is the Shipibo name that was given to Dean, which refers to the hummingbird and all of the precious energies thereof. So a sweet little name, the sweet nectar of the hummingbird, if you will, which was bestowed upon Dean while he was apprenticing in the jungle. So Dean has a background in psychology, Buddhism, and various body-mind synchronization practices, and is equally passionate about psychosis and awakening. He has a vast interest in technologies that address healing and liberation through the somatic medium of the subconscious mind, and this has brought him to the study and the practice of therapeutic breathwork, intuitive readings, and energy psychology as adjunct therapies to the plant medicine work. But the core of his passion currently lies in guiding people through the alchemical ritual retreat known as plant Dieta, which he explores with us in this conversation. So you can connect with Dean and his mailing list through his Proton Mail account, which is pinonsui at protonmail.com. And there were several glitches in the video component of this dialogue, so this is an audio-only episode, just in case you are watching this on YouTube or anywhere else for that matter. But aside from that, let's just get straight into it. If you are interested in some of the teachings that the plants have to offer us as human beings, then I'm sure you are going to find a gemstone or two within our conversation to carry with you on your own path forward. It is a pleasure to have you on, especially since two of my previous guests, Lara Charlotte and Sky Cielita Flor, had kind and warm things to say about you. So, firstly, thanks for being here, mate. I'm looking forward to receiving your stories and transmissions from the jungle. And as we were saying, no doubt you've picked up a thing or two spending 8 years over in the thick of the Peruvian Amazon.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to it as well. And got to give a shout out to Lara and Sky for bringing the bridges. And thank you for having me on, and thank you for what you do. Is clearly an amazing platform, and clearly you're serving the wider world of the plants and their wisdom by sharing what you share. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dean. Yeah, I appreciate that. The way that I love to start things off is by asking my guests what their relationship is to honoring the sacred. So I would love to ask you, how has your relationship evolved when it comes to honoring the sacred? As I'm sure your 8 years in the jungle has informed this to a great degree. And furthermore, if you'd love to share any words or prayers or something as an offering to open up our time and space together, and in light of honoring the sacred, the invitation is certainly here.
Alrighty. So it's a good way to get in there. I'll begin with saying I feel like there's little that is more sacred than silence. Silence being the audible aspect, but space being the palpable or tangible aspect or felt aspect of silence. So one way in which I try to honor the sacred is by allowing space for space, allowing space for silence. And that's both within myself, usually through practices or making the space for practices, be those daily or also more kind of in larger or more concentrated times, i.e. through retreat or on Dieta or things like that. And also in my relationships through listening, allowing someone the space to be heard, to be felt, and hopefully be understood. And as you know, I'm sure that that's critical in interspecies relationships, and learning cross that bridge, or not just cross that bridge, make oneself open to having that bridge be, be crossed, or having that contact. That's on a level. Another way I would answer the question is I aspire to honor the sacred by honoring life. Um, if the divine interpenetrates everything, then the best way I can relate to each being is the best way I can relate with as much love as possible is honoring the sacred, and that is something that my most treasured plant teachers have kind of brought me back to again and again and again is love, and finding all the ways that all the subtle subversive ways in which I might not be expressing love or living love in a way that I could, and it's distinct from an intention. Like I love myself, but that doesn't mean that I don't have subtle ways in which I deny myself, in which I am aggressive towards myself, in which you know what I mean. So kind of really weeding out all of the weeds that were not forged in love, and allowing that to change the way I relate first to myself and then obviously to all that I encounter. That's another way of honoring the sacred. Another way I could answer the question is, for me, the plants are sacred. They are my teachers. And I say the plants in general. There's a personal flavor to my plant matrix, the plants that I work closely with. And I honor them by continuing on the path, being the best vessel that I can be, but also the expression of that. And that's in ceremonial work, in conversation, in whenever the plants want to express themselves through any part of me, whether that's spoken or written or even movement, in order to possibly allow themselves to be seated in another person or landscape or anything. Um, that's part of my honoring them, is allowing me to be a vessel, servant, co-conspirator for them. Let me see if there's another way. Yeah, there is. They, in my mind, in my perception, my experience, are emissaries for the earth, spokespeople for the earth. And some plants have their own agendas, their own global agendas, their own agendas for humanity and sustainability and things like that. And they clearly have their own agendas, but it seems to be, in cahoots with the agenda of the earth, or as spokespeople, not spokespeople, as spokesplants for the earth. Obviously, there's some overlap, but then some distinction with personal agendas as well. But something they've highlighted recently is something that I read about in Stephen Buhner's work, which is that the song of the earth, as it is sung through any one human, when they've found their exact place in the larger system, the place that makes them sing with passion and be fulfilled, and where their work is indistinct from their life, and their love for their life is their love for their work, then they've found their place in the system. And that's what the system needs, is more people, more cells, more units, to find their place where they are overflowing with contentment, fulfillment, peace, love, passion, and that having a natural resonant effect on all of the cells, units that surround that one, to bring the whole system into harmony through that each individual unit cell finding that harmony. Then it's in line with the earth and how the earth wants to express itself through that being, as that being. So that when they started to impress this upon me, they brought it up in the context of a collective awakening that's happening, and it's given our context, our place in this time and space. It's what's needed more than an individual, an individual like another Buddha, another Christ, because the focus is then more on the collective as opposed to an individual. We've gone through the individualistic thing, or we're going through it rather, back hopefully to a place of connection and interdependence from having been through the path of the individual, so to speak. So with the emphasis being on a collective awakening and enlightened communities, as opposed to enlightened individuals. This is one of the contexts that they brought it up as in to me, and it was also combined with multiplicity as a concept. So kind of the breakdown of the concept of the individual on so many levels. Like we're made of, there's more bacteria in our foreign bacteria in our beings than there are us. Not that there is any one thing that we can point to biologically that is us, but we share our body with other beings. Developmentally, we share our psyche or our consciousness with other parts of ourselves that have distinct personas and personalities that can be engaged with on a shamanic level. And then spiritually, the more I do this work, the more I see that the line between where I end and my friends, my begin, gets blurrier and blurrier. So yeah, I feel like I'm rambling a bit, but doing that the best I can, finding my own place, and then potentially holding space or guiding others to do the same, if only by example, is also one of the best ways I can honor the sacred. So I would like to share a little prayer, or it's an invocation that I use to start my work, really, whenever I want to connect with my friends. So I'm just going to close my eyes for this. I'm here in service of a love that has no beginning and no end. I'm here in service to the spacious wisdom that is the essence of all beings, from where this love pours forth. And breathing into this still point of the lotus in the heart space, connecting with this space that contains all space, connecting with this space inside, that through this connection is connected to all things. And dissolving into this space any tension, unwanted thoughts, and incompatible energies. And igniting with a flame or a spark, the warmth, the vibration is the manifestation of love. Letting it ignite the space and moving through the cells, permeating the cells of the body, and then moving outward in all directions. And from here, I would like to invite and open myself to my diets, to the 8, to Noira, Lotus, Marusa, and Sanachi Chakra. Your doctors, your emanations, your Mariah, your enlightened beings. All of those that wish to be present here, myself and Kayu, in our bodies, in our minds, in our hearts, and in the hearts of all our listeners, so that your message may be heard, that it may plant seeds, that it may inspire, that it may assist and benefit those that hear it. Thank you so much for being here with us today.
Silence, love, plants, and alignment to heart and soul in a way that has coherence and harmony with the entirety of our living, breathing animate landscape. Beautiful. I would love for you to build some context for us here. So it might be nice to do that by sharing maybe some of the key stepping stones when it comes to how you came to apprentice yourself to the call of the Peruvian Amazon and the ways of Shipibo curanderismo. And also, I'd love to know a little bit about the contrast in your perspective when you first started working with ayahuasca and various teacher plants or master plants in the jungle compared to, say, 4 years into this work and then 8 years on, how that kind of progression in perspective went for you.
Might have to ask you to remind me about the second half of the question, but I'll answer the first half first.
Okay, cool.
The first key stepping stone was I was 18. I just finished high school when I went to the Peruvian Amazon for the first time and drank. It was a week-long program, just 3 ceremonies. And it was the second ceremony where at some point in the second ceremony, I was like, I was just coming out of high school, trying to ascertain what I wanted to do with my life. And I was just like, this is it. Ironically, I wasn't, prior to that, I wasn't much of a plant person. I was definitely more of a curious consciousness explorer through, substances. There wasn't definitely, I was interested in meditation. I was interested in music as therapy. I was interested in a number of things that all seemed to be coalesced in this ceremonial experience and in this form of medicine and therapy. And so even without having much of a clue about plants or what I was really getting into, at that point in time, I was like, this combines all of my passions. It wasn't even that conscious on a kind of intellectual level. It was just like, yeah, this is it. So I made a decision then I made a promise to myself essentially that I would come back to Peru with the intention of not leaving. And that came to pass. I had another important stepping stone is that I did a psychology degree in the interim, an undergraduate degree, and I was incredibly fortunate and blessed to go to an interesting school, Naroka University in Colorado, and it's super progressive because it was started by a renegade, enlightened, controversial Tibetan monk, or used to be a monk, and the school was amazingly progressive and very pivotal. And I say this because now I'm passionate about kind of joining the worlds of certain aspects of modern psychology with the plant work and merging those two worlds and taking the wisdom from both and to evolve. So it became really, really pivotal. But at the time, even though I was amazed and just blown away and incredibly happy to be there, I also had this like, I want to be in Peru, I want to be in Peru, like niggling,
the calling.
And yeah, the calling. But I'm incredibly glad that I did that, and it's served me and my plant work tremendously. So that was a stepping stone.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was there for 5 years, and part of that was also doing some work in the field, and so getting kind of the first taste of working with people in some extreme states of body and extreme states of mind. That was also pivotal. And then I left there and I came to South Africa first and then went straight to Peru. And there were some stepping stones there. I remember, the first person I met at the school was a guy who's also practicing curandero. And the first night I was there before the school actually started, we met and we spoke about ayahuasca. So I took that to be a good sign. And then I had a ceremony towards the end of my stay there where I decided, I was like, okay, this is what I decided to do. And it was with this person. And I told him, I was like, okay, I'm going to Peru. This is it. And I had the hardest ceremony I've had to date. It was incredibly traumatic.
Threw you into the deep end early.
brutally, brutally traumatic. And I was like, no way. There's no way. Not a chance. But the next morning I came around, fortunately. But that was a stepping stone. And then another pivotal part of that was how I ended up at the Ayahuasca Foundation is where I've been. And that's through their training and then also being able to work for them that I was able to stay for 8 years and in an 8-year apprenticeship. Otherwise, it would never have been possible. And Sky was pivotal in that, and so was our other brother that we grew up with. His name is Karen. He was assisting. He'd done the program, and he'd done the first ever program that Carlos, the founder of the Ayahuasca Foundation, did with Enrique, who came to be the founding curandero. Carlos and Enrique together made the foundation. It's since grown to include other curanderos, family members, but they started it, and this friend of mine and Sky's just coincidentally happened to do the first ever program that they ran. And it was his recommendation that took me to that specific place. And on the course that I attended, he was assisting and Sky was a participant. So we grew up together. It was the first time the three of us had been together in many, many years. And it was massively influential because I ended up getting hired at that point. I'd messaged Carlos and I'd said to him, I was like, I hadn't met him at this point. I'd messaged him before I got there and I was like, I promised myself that the next time I go to Peru, I'm going for good. And do you have any positions? And he was like, well, actually, we're just starting to look for people. And so, yeah, no guarantees, but come along. And when I got there, he was like, oh, actually, I have my people, my employees. And so I was like, disappointed and dejected, but fortunately at some point in my training he decided to trade me out for someone. and that was it. Like it was incredible how I'd leaped into, I spent a year saving as much money as I could, which wasn't very much money, and spent a lot of that on the training, and then just jumped, and the universe totally caught me and cradled me and put me in the most amazing possible context situation that I could have imagined, beyond what I could have imagined, actually way beyond, way beyond. And the amount of gratitude that I have, and just this feeling of like perfection, like it was the perfect place. It's put me on the perfect path. I couldn't foresee, my life. I couldn't imagine my life without it. And the amount of gratitude I have for that, for Sky and Karen being, so pivotal in that, and for the person that took me to Peru in the first place and took me to that university. She was my girlfriend at the time. Her name is Michelle, and she's also on the same path now, doing the same work. The amount of gratitude I have for those people and for everyone at the foundation and for all the plants as well at the foundation. It's there aren't words really. It's like I couldn't. It's not just gratitude. The word gratitude doesn't really cut it. It's like if it was a story, I couldn't have written it. You know what I mean? It's like it was so magical and synchronistic that like it's hard to conceive that it happened even and is happening.
I could certainly resonate with those sentiments on my own path. Always looking back and reflecting. It's a trip, no doubt.
It's good. I mean, it's definitely a sign that you're on the right. Things are going according to plan.
For sure. So tell us a little bit about the contrast in your perspective and kind of how that developed as you started to deepen into your relationship with the plants.
Firstly, the experience of ceremony changed a lot. I remember just being motherlessly inundated with all kinds of, sensations, information, but also just feeling like I was drowning in the experience. And that changed a lot. over time. I think part of that's physiological. Your body becomes used to processing the medicine, and so the state becomes less contrasted to your normal state, or just becomes like an alternate state that you just kind of switch into mode.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I was definitely, my immersion was difficult. It was wrought with shadow processes, and it was all kind of shoved in my face. And obviously, in the beginning, it was was less of a conversation. It was less of a co-creation. It was more just like this. I guess I wasn't aware of the degree to which I was creating my own suffering. Put it that way. I've become more aware of the degree to which I was creating my own suffering, and particularly in the experience with not just the ceremony, but with the dietas, also with certain medicines, how a large part of my experience was colored by my own relationship to myself and or lack thereof, my own, certain things that were in the shadow, that were not conscious. Yeah, subconscious beliefs that I had been holding on to, that I had been programmed to hold on to. A lack of awareness of what it was like actually to relate to these beings, and all sorts. I even came to see how one's birth trauma circumstance is often, for some people, projected onto their relationship with the plants and follows a similar kind of shape as it's being resolved or brought to light, And so, yeah, my relationship to myself, my relationship with unresolved things from childhood or parental figures, and the birth trauma were all playing out in this, and I was none the wiser to it at the time. And so there was a lot of like, why is this happening? Woe is me. Because it went through phases. Like the first phase was dark. There was a lot of light. There was a lot of relief, but it was largely a struggle. And then there was a phase after that where it was kind of like shown a light unlike any light I've ever seen in my existence. It shown glimpses. And to be honest, I mean, those were strong enough to keep me going and to keep me devoted. And I spent a long time. What would ostensibly, if one looked at it at a superficial glance, look like chasing the dragon, but really it was like they needed to show me certain things to give me impetus, to give me incentive to kind of to then go through the latter phases of further tests, and further feelings of, I guess, abandonment, and feelings of lack of self worth, and questioning myself, a lot of self doubt, and a fairly long phase of that. Those glimpses, those peak experiences, were essentially the fuel, to go through the longer shadowy phases before coming out into the light, I guess you could say, emerging. And to be honest, that emergence has only been a process that it's probably started, I want to say, I guess 2017. So it's been the last 3 years that it's been like on the up, I guess, or moving towards more light and openness, and out of a very long shadowy process. And comparison was a big thing. Comparison and expectation. I've come to see more and more how on the plant path, the analogies of plants obviously keep coming up and being pertinent to people's experiences. And when the plants see themselves in you, and one starts the dieting process, we always tell people that you're no longer human. Like, you are now a mutant. You are now X-Men, X-Woman. And this is what this dieting process is. It's, essentially changing you on such a deep level to become part plant. And so, like plants, I mean, it's depicted perfectly in that Osho Zen tarot deck. I don't know if you're familiar with. There's a card called Comparison, and it's got bamboo, and I think it's got oak. And it's like, bamboo is bamboo. It is and does as bamboo does. It's not meant to be like the oak. Oak is the oak. So if us as humans, looking at other humans and the other humans on this path and being like, oh my God, this is their experience. Why don't I have that experience? What's wrong with me? That's where it went for me, actually. It was like, their experience is like that. I wanted that experience. Think I not only wanted it, but thought I needed it. I needed it to look a certain way. So then the next question that followed was like, what's wrong with me? Why is it not happening? Oh, I must be broken. And that, again, the seeds of that were not from that moment. The seeds of that were from way before, in childhood, and it was being played out. The relationship with the plants was mimicking that, so it could come to the surface, come to the fore, and actually be worked on and eventually changed. But I wasn't honoring my individuality and my individual experience, my personal plant, the plant of me, the meanness of my plant, and allowing the specific, unique way that it wanted to take form through comparison. So when I started to do that, wow, like things changed. And also what was pivotal was also through this expectation and desire, I realized that I wasn't doing something that was critical to the whole thing, which was allowing the plants to work on their terms, allowing them to interact with me on their terms in the ways that they saw fit in all of their knowing, and their higher perspective knowing. I was putting my puny little perspective on top of it, being like, no, this is the way, And as soon as I was like, actually, okay, you're going to talk to me in the way that you want to talk to me. You're going to show me things in the way that you want to show me things. And just being open, being like, okay, how do you, here's my question, or here's my intent, or whatever. And okay, so what would you like me to know about it, and how would you like me to know about it? As soon as I started doing that, then also things changed. And it's like, some people learn that very quickly. It took me many years. It's like, and when it come out of it, it's like, yeah, duh. But that shadow complex was thick for a period of time, for a long period of time. And then so to go back to the question, at first it was like me, and then it was like, okay, you, and then it became more, the relationship matured, so it's more like we, and it's more like a dance, and it's more co-creative, and it's more like sometimes there's a lead over here and sometimes there's a lead over here, and it's more of the relationship and the dynamic is more of an even playing field. I'm not saying there's an equality, obviously there's no equation. I mean, I can't even begin to conceive of what life or perception is like from their point of view, although they have given glimpses, but those are just glimpses, but as far as the dance and as far as the work, now it's more of an even playing field. And that's also something that they keep bringing up as well, is like, well, you have this idea that they are these phenomenally, ineffably powerful beings, but they also keep being like, actually, you are a multi-dimensional powerful being yourself, and sometimes you can ask yourself, sometimes you don't always have to ask us. So yeah, then like opening the keys. But my relationship to them has changed in the ways that I've described, but they've also helped me change my relationship to myself, both what I am as a being, but then also, yeah, the other parts of myself, and therefore being able to kind of call on and rely on deeper parts of the self.
Yes. And I think it's important for us to frame what it is that you're talking about, communing, learning from the plants. It is within this framework, this tradition, this practice of plant Dieta, which some of the listeners to this show may be familiar with, some may not be familiar with it. But either way, I would love to hear the way that you have come to articulate the process of plant dieta. And then from there, perhaps it'd be nice to hear what you have to say in regards to the process from an experiential reference point, and any particular plants that you have dieted that you may feel called to speak on or bring up in this conversation and elucidate further.
Yeah, good point. Good question. Thank you. I would love to, and I will. And there's a lot to say about that. It's a tricky thing, because at the foundation, I've been mainly involved at the training camp where people come to train and get initiated into the tradition, and that is the diet. The diet is the beginning of that. It's the middle of that. It's the end of that. The whole emphasis of that program and the training in general in the Amazon, as far as I'm aware, that's beyond. I trained with the Shipibos, but as far as I'm aware, most of the tribes, if not all, in Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, Brazil, have some form of what they call dieta. And so when we start the training, we have a 3-hour talk about the diet and what it is before they actually start. And this is something. There's a lot that could be said, but it's funny how you have that 3-hour talk and you have to keep coming back to it. It's like a lot of things. It's hard to explain what a diet's like until you've done maybe not just one, maybe several. And I swear, every time, it's been 8 years I've been dieting, every time I do a diet, I'm like, that's what a diet is. That's how you're supposed to do a diet, But okay, on a basic level, it's the combination of the contract that you make, the promise that you make with a certain plant to fulfill a certain time period. And the contract has certain
Agreements?
agreements, clauses, agreements that need to be completed. One of them is the time. So if you're promising to yourself and to the plant 2 weeks, then 2 weeks. And another part that's inherent is the many different things that you have to abstain from. And so those being salt, refined sugar, oil, any sexual activity. Beyond that, and this is also pertaining to specific plants, you also need to do your best to abstain from projecting your anger or ill will onto other people, or i.e. taking responsibility and ownership of your experience and your emotions and your reactions. Also, you want to try and aspire to give as much as you can of your awareness, your concentration, your focus to the plant. So all of these things are making your being, your mind, and your body ripe so that the plant can seed itself and not only seed itself, but start to grow. So just like a tree is sturdy, is hard, but when it was a sapling, it was incredibly sensitive. And in order to get to the stage where it's fortified and therefore more resilient, it took a lot of care and the right amount of sunlight and water and air and nutrients in the soil and all of that jazz. All of these elements, these variables, had to be in the right quantities and in the right conglomeration for it to grow to the stage that it did, where it then became established and resilient and somewhat impenetrable. So the diet, as in the actual what you're allowed to consume and not consume, and it gets more specific, and it's also different from plant to plant about certain fruit that should be avoided and certain vegetables that should be avoided, and this also changes from teacher to teacher and tradition to tradition. But all of those things in conjunction with the mental aspect. So how much focus are you giving to the plant? How much love are you giving to the plant? How much, and part of that is the plant is processing itself through you. So you having a process, and typically, people are processing things, they're healing things are coming to light. So how much energy are you giving to that? All of these things are you're trying to create the optimum environment for this plant to seed itself in you, and then to germinate, and then to grow, and then to root, and then to
Yeah, one of the ways that I like to think about it is tending the inner garden, as in the inner garden is perhaps the soil. And then when we are consuming the plant, that plant, if it's in liquid form, comes down to the body. And just like that seed, like you said, that seed gets to take up residence in the soil of our system that we've cultivated so well. And it's then when we tend to the seed in a nourishing, nurturing, loving capacity, and that is through abstaining through all of the measures that you spoke to and entering into these agreements, then the seed, this plant, then has a chance to blossom throughout the entirety of our being. And as it blossoms, sometimes as it digs its roots in, it stirs up some of that dark, murky energy that we've been storing in our system for perhaps our whole lives, and perhaps it lasts or it has stemmed from a long, long time before that intergenerationally. So there is the process of, as you said, working through our own things as this plant has a chance to take root in a deep way and blossom and unfurl and grow into that big, sturdy plant or tree.
Absolutely. And excuse me. I think essentially love is the key ingredient, and agreeing to do these things, agreeing to abstain from this, and this, and that is something that you can give to the plant. Fasting, abstinence is something that you can offer to the plant as a gift of love, because you can't. It's a plant. You can't get it an iPhone or.
Well, yeah, and I guess one of the ways in which we are giving is through our sacrifice. That is a form of love in itself.
Exactly. And someone that came to us had an amazing thing to say about sacrifice. The etymology of sacrifice, sacrifice, actually means to make holy. So we have generally, I mean, if you talk about sacrifice in the form of abstinence, people generally is something that people don't want to do. But looking at it like that, letting go of something, abstaining from something in order to make holy or honor the sacred, and using your words can change the attitude. Knowing that it's the gift. So this is how we are showing our love to the plants. One of my teachers says that love is measured in actions. So it's one thing to say like I love you, but it's another thing for me to like act in ways that show you that I love you, that make you feel loved. So it's one thing to be like, okay, I love the plants, but it's another way to act in ways that actually prove, or that then, because it's essentially they they want to know that you're committed to yourself. They want to know that you're committed to them. They want to know that you're committed to the path. They want to know that you're committed to your own healing, and they want to know that you're committed to service. And that's the dietas, the abstinence, and the things that we give up is one way of showing them. There's other ways, though, like meditating on them, singing songs for them, writing poems. Love is the key ingredient, and you can almost infuse any action to turn it into a gift for them. But there are, at least in the tradition that I've learned, and there are reasons beyond that certain things need to be abstained from. For example, salt will kind of cut the effect of certain plants, and you can use salt to cut the effect of certain plants intentionally in ceremony, for example. Sugar is the same. Also, we give a lot of preservatives, plants that make people vomit or have diarrhea, to detox very heavily on a physical level. And if someone has taken one of those and they're kind of in over their head, or they need to be brought down, giving them obscene amounts of sugar will cut the effect of the plant. So oil, if excess oil will dissolve the alkaloids of plant medicine, so it's just also kind of weakening them. So if you're taking a plant either in a very strict medicinal setting, like if you're trying to heal yourself with certain plant medicines. Or if you're taking it in a diet context, and in a diet context, you're wanting the plant to penetrate your being as deeply as possible. If you were to be having salt, oil, sugar, you would just be kind of diminishing, possibly even nullifying the effect of the plant. So there are reasons for certain things, but a lot of it is you're trying to relate, to trying to create a relationship, and the point of the Dieta is to make your body a permanent temple for these plants, a permanent vessel for these plants, so that they can work through you. And in your Dietas, they work through you. If you're talking to someone, maybe it's counseling or something, sometimes they speak through you. If you do any kind of body work or energy work, they move through you. And if you're in ceremony and you're through songs, through the ikras, they move through you. So in any relationship, love is the binding force. So the Dieta is forging your relationship with these beings. And one thing I'd like to point out is that, so you have agreed upon time. You say you do 2 weeks or whatever, and then that's your Dieta, and then there's a time afterwards where the Dieta is integrating into your normal life, and also there's ideally this kind of what they call post diet, which you want to integrate slowly. So certain food items, you might wait a certain time or certain quantities of those items. Also certain things like sexual activity, there's a certain time period you got to wait, because an analogy that one of my good friends and coworkers uses is that when you're dieting, you're pregnant. So when you're pregnant, you know that every thought you have, every feeling you have, and everything you consume is going to affect that child in a massive way, maybe for its whole life. So if you're pregnant and you do crack cocaine, well, you just got to know that that's affecting more than just you in that period of time. And but similarly, when you give birth, then you're still connected to that infant, and you're still breastfeeding. So it's say someone's pregnant and they've decided to forego alcohol and tobacco for their pregnancy, but it's not like they give birth and then they go straight to the bar. You know what I mean? Like it's the same with the post diet. So now you've given birth, but still you're connected, and still what you consume, not just with your mouth, with your eyes as well, with your ears, is still going to affect that sapling. So this is why the more that one diets over time, there's certain parts of the diet, because people think like the diet is the diet, and then I'm done with the diet and I'm back to normal life. And then it might be that way in the beginning, but at least for myself, the more I've dieted, the more the plants have suggested, sometimes gently and sometimes strongly, that certain lifestyle changes become permanent. For example, there's a long list of things that I no longer can or choose to eat. And some of them, there was a strict or an obvious suggestion, but others, it's like they just made the dieting process made my body sensitive enough to feel the response of certain food types. But then there's also certain environments that I can no longer really energetically stomach to be in. And so my point is just that dieting over time is not limited to the time of the diet. In my experience, it seeps into your life, and it becomes like a path where certain sacrifices are asked, or not only asked but made obvious that they're needed, and on a permanent basis. And it changes us eventually permanently, and with that come permanent changes in our lives, behavioral, or also in terms of what we consume.
Yeah, totally makes sense. And Dieta is such a big process of purification and becoming sensitized to energies as well. So, of course, there are going to be those environmental lifestyle changes that come with this path. And something that you mentioned was the elevated perspective of certain plants. And I would love to know what you've got to say when it comes to the elevated perspective of certain plants. And also, in your experience, what gives certain plants an elevated perspective over other plants?
I'm glad you asked. Well, when I said certain plants, what I meant was I can only speak for the plants that speak to me. I can't speak for other plants. So I said certain, not to like distinguish them, but only because I'm not speaking to every plant on the planet. So I don't know about other plants. But the plants that I do know about or have a relationship with, is a better way of saying, I've kind of explained it thus. If you think of a tree is high spatially, and so if there's a person walking on a path and there's a tree above the person, it can see just from its perspective where the person has come from, where the person is going, what's around the corner. Maybe there's an animal around the corner, and then it can assume that if the person bumps into the animal, that the chances of the person freaking out, getting surprised, is probable. The tree can also see the pace that the person is moving with. And so basically there's a lot of things that can be seen just from having literally an elevated perspective. But now how this applies is that the more that they've shown me glimpses of this, so the more, we take certain plants to get high, but and getting high often gives us a different perspective where we recontextualize and reframe certain things, whether that's like a relationship we have or forgiveness, or whether that's like the nature of ourselves or the nature of reality. It's the getting high or getting out of our conditioned mind state that allows us a new way to look at things. But how this has come about is that they've shown me in bits and pieces what it's like for a being. So a plant, the part of the plant that we see is the third dimensional aspect. But a plant is not a third dimensional being, or it's not limited to the third dimension. I don't know exactly, I can't specifically say, nor has it been part of my experience of like the specific differences between the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, whatever dimension. I just know that higher than the third, right? And they showed me once upon a time, the first analogy they gave me was like a fourth dimensional being interacting with a third dimensional being is kind of like a third dimensional being interacting with a second dimensional being. So a human playing Pac-Man, you're controlling Pac-Man, but you can see what's around the corner for Pac-Man. Is it the fruit? Is it his girlfriend? Is it the evil gonna munch you? So you can tell with a relative degree of certainty what's in Pac-Man's future if Pac-Man goes around that corner. You can also tell where Pac-Man has been. So time-space continuum being like how we define the three-dimensional experience, then if you go up a dimension and you're interacting with the third dimension, then time and space is not what it is for a third dimensional being. The time axis is accessible in one moment, and the space is not what it is for a third dimensional being. That's why spirits are not bound to form and the need to travel distances in the same time frame that we are. They seem to be more heading towards like a certain type of omnipresence. And it's not just spirits. It works a similar way, to my knowledge, with enlightened beings and enlightenment traditions. For example, in Tibetan Buddhism, they engage with a whole bunch of forms or Buddhas, because they acknowledge that this being has gone beyond this dimension and therefore has access to all of space and all of time, so it can travel through space and time. And so making the forms in the meditation gives the being something to walk into so that they can interact on a level of being to being, in a way that's somewhat accessible to a third dimensional being. And so acknowledging that plants existing on not just the third dimension, but beyond. So what we see of a plant is just kind of, so if a third dimensional being makes a handprint on a piece of paper, that's a 2D impression of a third dimensional being. So yeah. So what we have a vision of a plant, or we have a conversation with a plant, or we even see the physical plant, that's just the handprint. That's just a slice of the plant that we can experience through our 3D perspective, and it's but a fraction. And so we can't ever actually conceive of what it might look like from a fourth dimensional and beyond point of view, even we can get glimpses, and they can start to open our perception and our senses to kind of, not just have them limited to the third dimension, but still it's just a glimpse. It's not the perspective of 4D from 4D. It's still a perspective from 3D. But so then I'd had experiences where the plant could see where I was headed, could see that there was a trial or tribulation further along my path that was absolutely what I needed, 100,000%. Because of their elevated perspective, they could see that. They could see, they know me, they know me from the inside out, and they know what's better, what I need more than I know. So having the experience of almost being led into what at the time seemed like a trap. it's like, wait a minute, you brought me here, and in that moment, it seems like I'm in a personal hell. But then time goes by, healing happens, perspective is gained in hindsight, and then I'm like, oh, that was exactly 100,000% what I needed. So after having gone through this a few times, and then starting to see things in myself and other people, not from the point of view of one specific point in time, but from a point of view of like over here, seeing it as a process, and therefore being like, okay, I can see why this is necessary, even though it might seem strange, it might seem irrelevant, it might seem inappropriate. But because of how it affects the process, and seeing that it's about the process and the end result of the process, or more specifically, the alchemical changes that the process is going to create for a certain person. And so just, being able to, I find that in merging with them, my perspective has started to shift from a singular point in time to looking at things from over here and seeing like, okay, seeing it over a period of unfolding time, as opposed to just this moment in time. And that pertains to trauma on a personal level and on a global level. I feel like this perspective brings peace, because from this perspective, you can see that calamity is just part of a process of waking up and growing, and that whatever traumas, tribulations, emergencies, that like, that like panic sets in, like, oh, it's the end of the world, or the end of my personal world, or the end of the world at large. You fast forward in time, and then you're like, oh, wait a minute, that was just medicine. That's all it was medicine. It wasn't the world trying to hurt me. It wasn't like, me being punished for my bad karma. It was just exactly what needed to happen. So in keeping with this, the plants turned me on to this idea, or it's actually a field of study, a relatively new field of study called post-traumatic growth. And the way that I'll share with that story how it happened, as it happened. It was, trying to remember, maybe 2015-ish. Anyways, I'd been working with traumatized people for a while at that point, and I met two people at the same time that were more traumatized than anyone I had met. I've met more traumatized people since, but at that point in time, it was so severe that I felt traumatized just by working with them, that I experienced some vicarious trauma. And I then was asking the plants for a while, why? It's just like, why? I mean, trauma seems to be such a universal part of human experience, at least, that I was like, why? 6 months I was asking the question, and I eventually got an answer, and the answer went something like this. They said that trauma by its very nature divides something. It takes something that's unified or that's whole and it splits it into two. And the thing is that if the person chooses, this is the important part, if the person chooses to use that as fuel for reunification, the subsequent state of reunification is by far stronger and wiser than the initial unified state. And so there's many, there's many analogies that support this idea, like a broken bone, once mended, is stronger. There was also William Blake. I don't know if you're familiar with William Blake. He wrote, like, amongst other things, the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And Songs of Innocence was a volume about innocence and childhood, but also like the way that an innocent child sees the world, but also naivety. And the Songs of Experience were about adulthood and wisdom, but also skepticism and cynicism. But his whole point was that once in the state of experience, one can re-attain a state of innocence. But the difference is that second state of innocence can never be taken from you, whereas the initial state of innocence will inevitably be taken from you, is always taken from you. So they were saying it's like fuel for evolution, basically, which is why it exists, as far as everything in nature seems to have a function. Nothing in nature is just there for the sake of it. It's just obsolete. Everything seems to have a function. And so trauma, being at least an undeniable and inescapable part of human nature, has a function. And this is the function, is that it's fuel for growth. Obviously, it depends on the person. It depends on their choices. But this is what it can be. This is what it has the potential to be. Is fertilizer for the soul and for the being. And there was another thing. So one can view this in one's own life, or it became helpful both for myself and in working with other people to then be like, okay, what these things that have happened to me, what have they gifted me? You could say that, okay, it's what it's denied me is obvious, but what has it gifted me? And a very special person I came into contact with said also that nature doesn't close one door without opening another. And it's, we're programmed to just focus on the negative and the doors that has been closed, and be like, okay, well, I've been slighted in this way, and I've been denied this, and my life is so hard because of this, and this is how it makes my life so hard. But again, like, kind of taking a step back and seeing what we're unaware of and what the gifts are goes a long way in healing, in acceptance, in forgiveness, and in finding peace. And not just finding peace, but finding purpose. Because when I went through this process myself, I mean, I'm still going through it, but what I saw was, like, when I started to unpack the gifts, I saw that my challenges had given me certain things that were crucial for me to be effective in my work. It had given me certain gifts, and it's not just the challenges. It was the combination of, like, gifts, certain ways of, from a psychological point of view, like, a combination of both, like, benefits I'd received, certain strengths of my caregivers and my upbringing, in combination with the challenges and the specific tribulations. Those two together formed me into who I need to be to do the work that I need to do. And seeing that had a massive effect on, like, forgiveness, understanding, peace. And then thinking back to the trials, the tribulations, the suffering, it's hard not to be as appreciative of that as the beautiful moments, moments of expansion and love. And then seeing this process mimicked in a microcosmic way in the plant path, like, so many, like, different iterations of that, and then just seeing the pattern, this overall pattern. And also they brought my attention to how this happens in nature. For example, adaptogens are, for those that don't know, an incredibly powerful and healthy and beneficial plants for stress relief and therefore longevity. And they work on many different systems of the body, endocrine, hormonal, just about every. As far as general health, I mean, they're good for everything because stress is a critical factor in the cause of 95% of diseases, if not more. So adaptogens are good for everything, and they help you adapt. They help you thrive by adapting, and they adapt to you and your changing needs. And basically, adaptogens, the plants themselves, have become that way through enduring hardship. They've learned how to adapt and how to thrive by enduring hardship. And the plants that are the most adaptogenic live in the harshest climates, that where they're constantly being tried, being attacked, being by the climate, by insects, animals, whatever kind of predators they have. And that's how they come to be such good medicine, is through enduring hardship after hardship after hardship. There's some examples in popular media. I mean, in studying post-traumatic growth, they refer to the hero's journey, the most archetypical backbone of a story, really, like made popular by Joseph Campbell, where the person leaves their home, what's their comfort zone, experiences hardship, trial, tribulation, because of that, learns something new and brings it back to the community as medicine, as a teaching. In that series, I'm not sure if you've seen it, One Strange Rock. It's incredible about the Earth.
No, I haven't.
You gotta check it out. I mean, it's really amazing and it's really well made. But they were talking about how the planet Earth came to have water on it. Prior to it having water on it, obviously there were no life forms, but at least in the way that we know life forms to be. But the point still stands, I believe, which is that water came to the Earth through a series of intergalactic storms that I can't remember exactly, but it went on for a long time, that were insanely violent. Like if some being was on the Earth at the time, it would have looked like an apocalypse. Like just sheets of ice and this strange foreign object smashing the Earth. But then that came to be water, which then became to be the very source of all the life that followed it. There was another thing called the Great Oxygenation Event. And that's where something was introduced into the atmosphere. And if I believe, I can't, if my memory serves me correctly, there were life forms, but they were very basic. But this foreign element was introduced into the atmosphere, and it decimated everything that was there. It was oxygen. So when oxygen was introduced into the atmosphere, but it then became the basis for life that followed it. So yeah, there's examples of this at the level of the natural world as well. And so
Post-traumatic growth on an individual level, and then on not just the collective level of humans, but the collective level on a cosmic level as well. And it speaks exactly to the natural cyclical nature of all things. There is death and destruction intertwined with life and growth and rebirth.
totally, it's just a matter of perspective.
Yeah, one of the things that you mentioned you felt inspired to speak about, and it forms part of the path that you're walking now after spending 8 years in the jungle and now integrating back into the rest of the world outside of the jungle, and that is the reseeding of indigenous wisdom. And from one perspective here, we could certainly localize it to the Peruvian Amazon, or more specifically in the context that we're speaking to Shipibo shamanism or Shipibo curanderismo, and what they have to share when it comes to reseeding that indigenous wisdom. But then expanding from there, there is the greater theme related to being in harmony with the earth that many nature-based cultures or indigenous cultures still retain to a large degree. So what does it mean for you when you speak about reseeding indigenous wisdom?
The initial part of my answer is kind of, I wouldn't say it's culture specific, I would say it's technique specific, because this happened to me through the technique of the Dieta. And what I observe in myself and in many other people is that the Dieta does this, it kind of re-indigenizes, if you would like, people, but that doesn't mean that those people are going to become curanderos or that they're even going to continue dieting. It awakens a very primordial connection to from themselves, within themselves, to parts of themselves that they didn't know, which you could say were more indigenous. For example, their own blood lineage, the teachings, wisdom traditions within their own blood lineage. But they are beyond their own blood lineage. It also awakens people to their own spiritual heritage, which might be the same as their blood heritage, or it might be totally different. And so, certain people can be awakened to other traditions that are not part of their blood lineage, but it's very much part of the re-indigenizing of that specific person. That's why the plants work so amazingly, because I've learned about plants through the Shipibo tradition and how to relate to plants through the Shipibo tradition, but the plants are not limited to any tradition. And they can see inside someone and know exactly what's needed for this person. They might be like, no, you don't need to diet. You don't need to do ceremonial plant work. You need to do this instead, because they can see what's in a person. And again, over a timeline of various lifetimes, not just limited to this form that they've taken now, and these parents that they've taken now, and this blood lineage that they've taken now, or their place of birth and their culture, but what goes into the making of the entirety of them, including their entire past, including all their lifetimes. So I think the dieting process is playing a big role and will play a big role in the kind of reseeding of indigenous wisdom. And I mean, for me, I feel like, that's what I can see, because that's where I'm at, and that's what my role to play, and my passion, and the way that certain things want to happen through me is through sharing that process with people. And again, because on a deep level, it connects people with something outside of themselves and eventually to the earth itself. And I feel like it can play a pivotal role for those that feel called to do it in helping people find their place, their purpose, their passion. And that might involve plants, it might not. It might involve service, it might not. It might involve certain indigenous traditions, it might not. It's not limited to, once you put the plants in people, then when they bloom, it's like, it's not limited to anything other than the guidance of the plant for that particular person and what that particular person has inside of themselves. So, but having said that, it's also, I don't believe that diet wouldn't be what it is without meditation. And now there's certain translation difficulties, or not necessarily difficulties, but for example, my primary human teacher said, like, it's all about concentration. It's the word he uses, concentration. So ceremony is all about concentration. Diet's all about concentration. All you need is concentration. The more you concentrate, the more they can connect, the more they can inhabit you. But after having observed him for a long time, I think meditation is another word that he could use. He didn't use that word. It's not in his tradition. He doesn't have a tradition of meditating other than concentrating on the plants. But for me, it's been an absolute essential ingredient. And I think that's another part of reseeding indigenous wisdom is, and I'm using meditation in the most broad sense, in the widest possible sense of the word. A reason that the plant, the Dieta is so powerful and inspiring to me is because it combines, like, what is a very common thing in many indigenous traditions, which is this idea of retreat, this idea of removing yourself from your normal life and all of the distractions that your normal life contains, with work, media, friends, family, all of them, and leaving you alone with yourself. Or at least that's how it seems in the beginning. It seems to be that you're alone with yourself. So, so that you can start to relate with your own mind, with your own emotional body, with your own neuroses. Because our life is so full of things that it's so easy to not ever do that just because we're just distracted by, well, necessities and work and relating and putting food on the table and whatever it is. So another teacher of mine from a Tibetan Buddhist lineage, he says like the only thing you have to do in retreat is not do what you normally do. That's the only thing you have to do, is don't do what you do otherwise, and something will happen. A process will unfold. Something will well up from you, from your body, from your subconscious, because you're not doing what you normally do. Even if you don't do anything else, even if you don't meditate, even if you don't consume plants, even if you don't abstain from other things, all you have to do is don't do what you normally do. So I think the plant dieta is amazing because it combines retreat with the ritualistic consumption of these plants, with shamanism, you're engaging with interspecies relationships, engaging with spirit. And in my experience, what makes a diet good is meditation or concentration. So there's several elements there that are, some of which are not particular to the Shipibo culture. This element of retreat, this element of meditation, and then the plants. And then it's my experience and my perspective that certain teacher plants are enlightened beings, and it's an amazing thing because it's common now that there's these teachers, these gurus that are seemingly falling prey to their more human side and kind of falling from the light, so to speak. And an enlightened plant, it's a plant. It's not a human, so it's not necessarily subject to the trappings of being human, and the potential for temptation and greed and dominance and abuse of power. It's a plant. So learning from an enlightened being that's a plant, you could argue, has certain benefits over learning from a human. I mean, not, anyone that's lucky enough to meet an enlightened human is blessed and should follow that. There's no, you know what I mean? But it's just, I can know with a fair degree of certainty that my plant teachers aren't going to suddenly become drunks, or like greedy, like, you can be fairly certain that that's not going to happen. So this is a different level of certainty and a different level of trust and a different engagement. And in terms of, I think reseeding indigenous wisdom is kind of a stone on the bridge, on the path of reseeding enlightened wisdom. Again, like, the concept that enlightenment is pre-existing. It's everything that we put on top of it that we need to become aware of, disintegrate or deconstruct and remove to see through to what is really there. And I think indigenous wisdom is similar, or it's just a part of that. It's like we all are indigenous at some point in our ancestry. It's just a question of how far back and how in that time how much we've separated ourselves from everything else, and how much we've believed about our separation. So, when I think of reseeding indigenous wisdom, I think of animism. I think of human beings acknowledging that every other living thing has a consciousness, has a sentience, is no greater or lesser than. There's no hierarchy of being. It's all a system. It all works together. And then also the elements, or mountains, rivers, all of these things, like people acknowledging that they are living beings, that they are vastly intelligent beyond our wildest imagination, and therefore we shouldn't plunder and destroy and just treat them as if they were less than human or inhuman or not alive. But then if you follow that trajectory further, then it's like being connected to source, being connected to everything, knowing that you are inherently everything. That being another way of talking about enlightenment, yes, and you remove the ego and you see that you are just a vessel for the entirety of existence, also a manifestation of the entirety of existence, and that you very literally contain the entirety of existence within you. That's, it's get into like semantics, but that's like, you could say akin to enlightenment. So, and meditation being in the enlightenment traditions, pretty much the recipe for for getting there. And that also brings me back to space and relating with space as a being, as a living thing, and as the source. So having a retreat, giving yourself space to engage with life and with yourself in a completely different way, allows you again to like have a perspective, to see things from a different angle. And if we think, the plants have made me more cognizant of the elements, fire or the sun, water or the oceans, air, the atmosphere, the wind, and earth, the earth. But then there's also the element of space, without which any of the others could possibly exist. Space is the fundamental element, and it's also the element that is not subject to destruction. It's not subject to beginning and ending. It's the only thing in life that doesn't change. The other elements have a degree of being more constant or consistent than life forms that they hold space for. But we do know supposedly that the sun will eventually burn out, and then, well, there won't be life as we know it, and the other elements won't necessarily exist as we know it, other than space. Space will exist. And in the Enlightenment, in certain other wisdom traditions, in certain other indigenous traditions, for example, the Tibetan tradition, they are well versed in space, because that's what they have. It's like space. They live all the way up there, and it's a lot of space. So I think, again, that's another role that meditation has to play, is also beyond just extending our relationship with the other elements, extending our relationship, or even creating a relationship with an element that's often not considered an element. And in my perspective, it's the most fundamental element, which is the element of space. Space, again, silence being its song. So having time to be silent, having time to not. So meditation being a small version of that, but retreat or dieta being a larger version of that. In Dieta, when I started doing my dietas, not interacting with another human, it changed everything. And that traditionally, that's how it's done, is you don't interact with any other humans. And traditionally in the Shapiro tradition, so that you can learn to speak to the plants, so that you can develop the sensitivity to interact with the plants. But also, in my perspective, it's so that you can interact with silence, so that you can discover inner silence, so that you can discover inner space. Yeah. Preceding indigenous wisdom, I think I answered. That's my answer. I did remember. So what I was talking about with plants being like the physical part of the plant that we can see as the third dimensional aspect. If we think of the spirit of water or the ocean, and that the ocean and water is its third dimensional aspect. If we think of the spirit of fire, and that the sun and light on this earth is its third dimensional aspect. If we think of the physical earth being just the third dimensional aspect of the greater being of the earth that exists on God knows how many other dimensions and other forms, then if we think of our experience of the earth and the elements as just being the handprint, it's just being the third dimensional imprint of these larger beings, they show me that Okay, as third dimensional beings, what do we do on 2 dimensions? We write books, we create images, illustrations, graphic novels, and probably the most pertinent example to what I'm talking about is video games. As third dimensional beings, we take the second dimension and we create worlds within the second dimension. But we know that that is a creation. It's, as real as a creation. Like we're watching a movie, we know that it's a depiction. And so it engages us emotionally and intellectually, and we're engaged, it affects us. So you can't say it's not real, but we know that it's a creation. We know that if someone dies in the movie, they didn't just die in what we call real life. So they show me that this earth is there, these beings that exist on the fourth, fifth, sixth, whatever dimension, this is their creation that they've created on a third dimensional platform, a third dimensional palette, a third dimensional medium. It was a revelation for me.
Amazing, mate. It's amazing also how quickly an hour and a half, 2 hours can go by.
Oh my God. I had no idea.
I would love to wrap things up with you for now, perhaps by asking one final question. And to finish up, I would love to know if there is one particular experience that stands out, a mind-boggling experience that you've had over there with the plants in the context of extrasensory or supersensory phenomena, such as telepathy, shared experiences, receiving some sort of information or knowledge that you weren't privy to beforehand, or anything else that comes to mind that would make the Western mind start to malfunction due to the absolute bewilderment and amazement and wonderment that these plant experiences have to potentiate within us.
I'm actually going to answer your question in a roundabout way.
Okay.
In keeping with, yes, one of the underlying themes that we've been speaking about, I'm not going to talk about an isolated experience, but I'll talk about perhaps one or two isolated experiences in reference to a larger, how they pertain to a larger process. There were two experiences that were particular transmissions, particular speed transmissions that happened early on. And those being what they were like, okay, phenomenal experiences that definitely changed me and instilled a really deep sense of devotion. However, the depth of those experiences and the changes that they initiated I wasn't privy to the full scope and expanse of that until 8 years later, when I did another Dieta and saw how those seeds had actually shifted and transformed into trees, and were bearing fruit, and the fruit was then dropping and seeding itself. The first time I met my teacher, now I'm talking about non-human, primary teacher, I was in a ceremony that was I was fortunate enough that there was no one else in the ceremony, just me and my human teacher. And so it was a Dieta with this tree, and he was singing for a bit, and then he stopped singing, and he was like, "Have you seen her?" And I was like, "No." So he was like, "Okay, wait 15 minutes." So he started singing, and then about 15 minutes, I felt a tap on my shoulder, and I turned around to see. I looked back, and then I had to look up, because this being was as tall as the ceremony space, which is quite tall. And she was taking the form of Mother Mary, with that kind of, that garb, Mary's garb. And then her hands were roots that she started to place in my head. And what happened afterwards, I don't have words for. Like, fortunately, it was just me and him, because I was crying, screaming, writhing, laughing maniacally, and there was no. There aren't words for what happened there. I mean, I later recognized it as definitely this seeding that I'm talking about taking place on the deepest level, whatever that is, if it's DNA or whatever that is. But then afterwards, there was just an infinite field of love that went directly through my heart level. It was a plane, and it was completely infinite. And he then asked me to sing, and although my singing since then is technically way better, but I was never able to sing as I sang then, because every note was like my child that I gestated and then birthed and then raised and then sent into the world. The love had expanded time, so to a degree where I had that level of care and that level of love, and went on a journey with every single note, to the point that I could feel that it was, I would, gestated it, birthed it, raised it, sent it out into the world. So that was my intro to infinite love. And shortly afterwards, with the same plant, I had an experience where I saw the sun in a vision, and it hit the beam, went straight through my skull, and hit my pineal. But then what happened then was everything, in terms of quantum physics, it was like every particle became a wave in my body, in my environment, the physical environment. Everything just turned into pure potential. And it stayed that way for a long time. And there was layers of it. A layer of it stayed that way until the end of the next day. Another layer of it stayed that way for like 3 months. And so it was showing the essence of things being space, being empty. And since then, like, the essence of this being an enlightened being, has come to, come to understand it as light being penetrated by space, and light being an aspect of love, light being the kind of primordial vehicle of love. So space being awareness, light being love, and that's essentially, well, the essence. And those two things, to see now how they, how that gave me other, like, little tidbits here, and this like download here, and this experience there, and then to turn into eventually this state of what had been seeded, and now what has grown into a living being that is dropping its own fruit and is sharing its own seeds. So that to me is coming up as the most kind of pertinent. However, there was one time where they liquefied my skull, like physically. The cranium, my cranium was like liquefied in a square, like my actual skull. I mean, as hard as I can feel it now, it just turned in a square that moved like this. It just turned into liquid, and I just couldn't believe what was happening as it was happening. I was like, no ways, no ways. Literally, they intervened on a physical level, liquefied my skull while they were like rejigging my brain or whatever. And then, so that's a side note.
Nothing like a little bit of the liquefaction of the skull to finish up the podcast conversation, Dean. I really appreciate you coming on and having this conversation with me and sharing some of your story and your communion with the plants during your time over there in the jungle. And I trust that the path will continue to be as fruitful as it already has been, and that you will help guide many other people to their North Star, to their heart and soul's alignment within the greater alignment of our animate ecology. So thanks once again, mate.
Thank you very much, Caillou. I really, really, really appreciate it. I really appreciate you. I feel incredibly good vibes, and I feel like I would love to know about you at a later stage, and your story and your journey with them and your gems. I was amazed by, this is the first time I've ever done a podcast, and when you mentioned the time, I was like, what? That's wild. And so I can really feel what you're doing for the community, and what you're doing with plants, and I appreciate it tremendously. And I'm very happy and honored to be part of that. Thank you very much.